The United States and Canada have long been top allies, the two nations standing side by side on the world stage, sharing the longest undefended land border, and relying on each other for billions of dollars in trade. The result of this election will have major impacts on Canada. Canada and the U.S. are each other's largest customers. 75% of Canada's exports go to the U.S. Donald Trump has said he will put a 10 to 20% tariff on all goods coming into the U.S. That could mean a massive hit to the Canadian economy. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, isn't looking for a major shakeup in American trade policy, meaning things could be largely status quo for Canada. But whoever wins the election will be in charge when the new NAFTA comes up for renegotiation in 2026. Trump has also promised a mass deportation program which could push hundreds of thousands of migrants north to Canada. Remember, even relatively minor changes to immigration rules under the first Trump presidency caused a huge influx of illegal crossings into Canada. Experts say Harris's approach to immigration would likely be more in line with Canada's. The Biden-Harris administration did negotiate a deal with Justin Trudeau's government to allow Canada to turn back migrants at the border. Trump has said he would not protect NATO members that don't meet the 2% defense spending target. Canada spends just 1.37% of GDP on defense. And while the federal government does plan to meet the goal, that's not until 2032. Harris has said if she was president, the U.S. would remain committed to NATO, vowing to stand by the alliance and its causes, including the war in Ukraine. Kirsten Hillman is Canada's ambassador to the United States, and she joins me here now. Ambassador, it's good to speak with you in Washington rather than in Ottawa. Appreciate
welcome to Washington. Very happy to have you here.
Well, we're delighted to be here for a historic race. This is going to be. What's your sense of the state of this race with one day to go?
Oh, well, look, I mean, I know what Canadians know, what everybody is watching. This is a very, very, very tight race. I think even the people that we talk to here are experts in trying to understand the dynamics in the United States and in the swing states in particular, say it's too close to call, and they're not calling it.
Throughout this campaign, you've been part of the Team Canada effort to make sure the country's interests are represented and are heard by all the people who are running. How difficult has it been to make Canada's story heard in such a polarized political environment that we're seeing right now in the U.S.?
So that's a really good question, because I have to say, as we embarked on this more intensive effort to engage across the country, I thought, you know what, there might be some challenges. We were going into Texas, and we're going into Florida and South Carolina and West Virginia and Georgia and other states, and thinking, well, maybe Canada's not top of mind for them, even though we are the largest trading partner for most of those states, 2/3 of the U.S. states, as a matter of fact. But I'll tell you what I found. I found the opposite. I found there wasn't a single governor, there wasn't a single door that wasn't open to us where they wanted to talk about what we're doing together, what more we can do together. And so I do think it's important for Canadians to understand that the political rhetoric might be polarized, but the American value, the value that they put on the relationship with Canada is pretty consistent.
There's going to be challenges for Canada no matter who wins the White House. Probably more conventional challenges if it's Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. Trump's policy book is pretty disruptive to a lot of things. The biggest right off the top economically is the 10% tariff. He wants to slap on literally everything coming into the country. Do you have any clarity yet as to whether Canada might be exempted from that as part of NAFTA, CUSMA, whatever you want to call it, or whether we are outside that Trump tariff wall should he win?
So I think the starting point is that former President Trump, when he was the president, renegotiated the NAFTA. And in that treaty, we removed 99% of the tariffs between our two countries. From my perspective, from Canada's perspective, that's the deal that we have. Those are the rules that prevail between our two countries.
It's the deal you have right now.
Right. But should he want to change that, then he's changing the deal. And we have spent a lot of time talking to his allies and his advisors across the country, talking about the benefits that being in a zero tariff environment with Canada brings to the United States. We have more trade between our two countries in the past year since the new NAFTA, the CUSMA, came into force than ever in the history of our two countries. It's incredible. It's doing exactly what it's meant to do. So our message is, let's not turn that back. Let's build on the success that we had with the last Trump administration, should he regain the White House. And the message resonates. It resonates with his his advisors and his colleagues, but it's a conversation we have to take to him.
Well, I was going to say, as you know, it has to resonate with him, right? And so when you speak to the people, those layers below, the former president himself, I mean, are they telling you whether it's something Canada would have to deal with despite the trade agreement, or is it something a bit like what we're seeing now with the Biden administration and the Trudeau government aligning the Chinese vehicle tariffs? Is there an expectation of a continental alignment on a 10% tariff to deal with some of these things?
I think it's a great question, and the answer is I don't know yet. I think we're going to have to see till we sit down and have those conversations, if that time comes, with President Trump in his second mandate. I think that we have laid the groundwork very, very well, again, among some of his biggest supporters and his biggest allies, to demonstrate why it doesn't make sense to apply that policy to Canada. But we will have to have that discussion with him. And I think we're ready for it. I think we have a lot of very clear and cogent facts to bring to the table.
There was a report in the New York Times on October 28th that Canada, European countries, China are drawing up a list of things that they could hit back with in terms of retaliatory sanctions should Trump win and Trump go ahead with this. Is that happening as Canada? We saw this before when steel happened in the first administration, very surgically targeted tariffs at key industries and key Republican congressional seats, for example. Is that the sort of approach Canada's taking right now to get ready for this in advance?
I think Canada has to be ready. I think Canada has to be ready to stand up for ourselves. We succeeded as one of the only countries that had the tariffs taken off steel and aluminum. 232 tariffs, they were called, Canadians might remember at the time. And we did it because we met President Trump tariff for tariff, dollar for dollar. We didn't escalate, but we didn't back down. And that show of strength was very important. And it was very important to mobilize some of the people that are our allies to act.
So I don't want to misstate it. That's a yes. There is preparation happening to be ready for such a thing?
We're going to have to be ready for all the possibilities, yeah.
One of the other possibilities people worry about at the northern border, the southern U.S. border, dominates obviously the political debate in this election. But Trump's immigration policies call for mass deportation should he win. And just the threat of removing temporary protected status from Haitians in his first term led to a flood of people coming to Roxham Road in particular and coming across. This is on a much larger scale. He's talking about using the National Guard, the U.S. military to deal with this. How worried is Canada about what could move towards the northern border should he move ahead on this sort of pretty aggressive immigration policy? Well,
I think the first thing that we have to recognize is the means by which he would do that remain quite unclear. The legal authorities, the sort of logistics of even fulfilling that policy remain quite unclear, on the timing. And there's a lot of discussion here in the United States around that. So we are trying to understand, if he comes into the White House, what that would mean. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is, since the Roxham Road moment that you're referring to, we have sort of really stepped up our cooperation with the Americans on our border. You may recall that when President Biden came to Ottawa, we updated a treaty that we have between our two countries. Exactly. And that treaty allows both of our countries to return asylum seekers back to the other country when they show up at ports of entry or between the borders. It's a very important tool. It's important to us. It's important to the Americans. So that will have a big effect on our ability to manage any kind of increase in flow in either direction.
Well, again, it's assuming that survives, a change in presidency, right? Because if Joe Biden could come to Ottawa and change it, Donald Trump could also do the same, or just not enforce it on his side, right?
Absolutely, but it's in the U.S. interest, right? Because it is a two-way treaty, so it also applies for if people come into Canada and seek to go into the United States, it gives the U.S. the authority to send them back to Canada. So it is very much a mutually beneficial treaty. And I haven't heard anyone in Trump's entourage suggest that they're not interested in maintaining that treaty.
Well, I mean, there's treaty enforcement, and then there's whatever legal mechanisms he would use to do his mass deportation. But then there's the rhetoric and the threat of it and the fear in the migrant communities, right? Like, they've already been targeted in Springfield, Ohio, for example, with the cats and dogs narrative that was pushed. So I guess this is the thing. People I've talked to who work with migrant circles and immigration, this is what they point to, that just the fear of it could force that. This could be a challenge Canada has to deal with should he win.
Yeah, and I think it's a challenge for Canada. I think it's a challenge for other countries that may be called upon to deal with changes in migratory flows. It's something we'll watch carefully. But I guess I would just come back to the fact that the Trump administration now, the Trump team now and the administration when they were last in office, they were very eager to maintain a strong and safe and reliable border. They only have 2 borders. One of them causes them a fair bit of challenge. One of them does not. And I don't think they're interested in disrupting that reality and having 2 borders that are going to cause them some challenges.
Just as a final point, this is my first time in Washington, D.C., so I was very excited to walk around and see things and look at the White House up close. But there's 10-foot security fencing going up around the White House, the executive office building where the vice president works. You're seeing it everywhere. You're seeing shops boarded up. You know, elections are about the future. They're about hope. There's a lot of fear and anxiety in this one. What are your thoughts on what you're seeing in this election cycle in terms of the physical security in Washington, D.C. compared to last time?
So I guess there's a couple things I would say. One, for Canadians, the level of security that is often here in Washington in advance of large events is unlike what we see in Canada. So it really is. Like, there can be large demonstrations that are encouraged and that are perfectly sanctioned, but there will still be an awful lot of security, again, at levels that we're just not familiar with in Canada. So I would say that is a first thing. I also think, and we know this because the Canadian Embassy is right downtown in the middle of all, right? We're right in the middle of all of this really central part of the U.S. democratic environment. I think that it's important for American security forces to demonstrate strength as a disincentive to, violent or disruptive behavior. And I saw that at the Republican convention and at the Democratic convention, where I think there was also an expectation that there might be some disruptive activities. The security was super tight at both of them, and really there was virtually no disruptions of any kind.
Well, let's hope that's the case in the next 24, 36, however many hours it takes to get it all done. Kirsten Hillman, Canada's ambassador to the United States. Always a pleasure. Thanks for being here today.
Great to see you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Americans have a big decision to make tomorrow, and I know a lot of Canadians are thinking about it and talking about it. Our government has good relationships with the Democrats. We have good relationships with the Republicans. We are absolutely confident that we will be able to work effectively with whomever the American people elect.
Well, the latest polls show one of the closest presidential races in the history of American politics, with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump essentially neck and neck nationwide and across most of the key battleground states. We're going to get some predictions and thoughts on the stakes of this election from the Power Panel from Vandana Cotter, Gary Keller, Brad Levine, and Rob Russo. Rob, let's start with you, because in addition to being a former Ottawa bureau chief, you were the Washington correspondent for the Canadian Press once in a former life. What are your thoughts on this election and what's going on in the United States right now?
Well, I think it's always nice to hear the soothing bromides of people like Christopher Freeland and diplomats, current diplomats. But I think a former diplomat was closer to the truth, and that's Kelly Craft, who said on the weekend, we had all better strap in. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's going to be true no matter who wins. Clearly, if Donald Trump wins, the ride will be volatile. It will be unpredictable. He has said that he is proud of the fact that he's an agent of chaos, and he has a bilious relationship with our current prime minister. So that's going to be a really tough ride. It's not going to be an easy ride, though. If Kamala Harris becomes the president, she will probably owe her victory to protectionist parts of the states of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin in particular, that will be demanding some tougher clauses in a renegotiated North American Free Trade Agreement in 2026. So, yeah, everybody remain calm, but there's some real noise coming from the downstairs part of the North American continent, and it's keeping us up at night.
Well, you know, Brad, there's going to be challenges no matter who wins, but the order of magnitude of them are far greater if it is a Donald Trump victory, right? I mean, the 10% tariff he's talking about slapping on everything, the mass deportation promise that he's putting out there and talking about using the National Guard and the military to force migrants out of the country. I mean, you could have economic chaos along the Canadian border, surges of migrants fleeing whatever he's going to do, heading towards the Canada-U.S. border. I mean, the stakes in one direction are quite a bit more unpredictable and potentially more severe if it is a Trump victory.
Right. If you were to offer, two possible scenarios, renegotiate the trade agreement in a year and a half, 2 years' time from now, or the chaos that Donald Trump will unleash probably from day one. I think that's absolutely right. The order of magnitude is tremendously different. I don't think that we should underestimate both the economic and social challenges that a Donald Trump presidency will create for Canada. Let's just take a look. First of all, the economic. On the issue of tariffs, that is a significant issue for us. I think that we're not the main target, but we're certainly going to be the recipient. He has said quite emphatically that there will be no carve-outs for Canada when it comes to it. I don't even think that the people that support Donald Trump understand what the tariffs mean. They think that Canadians will pay more for things, when in fact it's actually the Americans who will be paying more for Canadian goods. That's one cap. The societal one, we saw it, under Trump in the first round in 1.0, but we also saw it under Biden, where their immigration and migrant policy had a direct impact on migrants coming into Canada, in a number of different areas. That is going to come fulsome again to Canada, and we already are having a conversation in this country about our numbers. You just saw Mark Miller and the federal government cut back on its targets coming forward. I think that's going to be small potatoes compared to what's going to happen if he does begin to round up people and send them back to their origins. I think we're going to have some really big, tough challenges almost immediately after he's sworn in, if he does win.
Gary, that's still the big question. But, Gary, on that, nothing about this election is kind of normal, right? I mean, Donald Trump could be elected president tomorrow. He could win the race. And then in a couple of weeks, he's due back in a New York courtroom for sentencing on his 34 convictions because he's campaigning while on bail, which is like the 40th absurd thing about this campaign on the list of weird things about this election. But when you look at the trade stuff, the direct economic issues, I was speaking with the ambassador earlier. She kind of confirmed reporting we saw that they're getting ready to drop a list of retaliatory tariffs if it comes to that. They're kind of hoping it doesn't, but there's enormous economic exposure if the Republicans pull it off tomorrow.
Yeah, and we've seen this playbook before from the Canadians, back when the last round was going on. I think we did the same thing last time in terms of having very targeted, focused tariffs. I think my favorite was they called up Mitch McConnell and they said, by the way, we're slapping a big fat tariff on Kentucky bourbon. So just so you know, so maybe stock up ahead of election night tomorrow night. But no, Canada's going to have to be ready to be armed and be ready to fight back. And as was said earlier, Kelly Craft said, buckle up, Canada. Things are going to happen. Flip side to that is Kamala Harris said very clearly a month ago to rally in Michigan, she was proud that she was one of 10 U.S. senators to vote against CUSMA or NAFTA 2.0, and that she would initiate a review as well of NAFTA 2.0. And, under Democrats, we've also seen, Buy America provisions that Canada has to fight very hard to get out of. And so there's no panacea necessarily when it comes to trade issues. But yes, not just the trade issues that we're talking about will be on the forefront. If Trump wins, NATO 2% is going to be a big issue that we're all going to be talking about, and how we reach that. Border security, and I think energy security to our last panel is also going to be a big focus going forward.
Yeah, I was at an event last week in Ottawa, Vandana, and there's a bunch of ambassadors there, people from NATO countries, very concerned about the implications of what happens tomorrow, certainly on the defense arrangements for NATO and what might happen in Ukraine, and the trade implications as well, because I know the Trudeau government dealt with this in the past on the very targeted Section 232 national security tariffs on steel and aluminum. But what's on the table now is a 10% across the board on absolutely everything, and the knock-on effect of that is catastrophic economically. How do you approach that if you're the Liberals?
I mean, I think this is something they anticipate could happen. So I wouldn't be surprised even from since the beginning of the campaign, they're thinking through what those retaliatory tariffs have been or could be. But we've seen this before. Like, yes, they were specifically for steel and aluminum, but I think it did show that in the face of a tariff wall, Canadians, the Canadian government will push back. Kirsten Hillman did push back on that, and she put her own tariffs up and didn't capitulate on that. So I think the difference between last time and this time is that the government is prepared in a way as if they experienced it before. So as much it is a buckle up effect, I think even if it's on immigration, on migrants, on tariffs, it's something that they are prepared for. They have been preparing for. I believe people and ministers have already been going to the U.S. to continue to build relationships amongst the Democrats and the Republicans. And they know that building that relationship is going to be a key part of it. So I think as much as it is, I'm biting my nails and watching like everyone else, I'm not as fearful because I do feel like this government is a bit more prepared.
Rob, just as a final point on the tariffs, I mean, if Canada is hit with the 10%, they retaliate. That becomes a problem. If Canada somehow carved out and the NAFTA countries are protected, but you've got to match what the U.S. is doing, like what we're seeing with the Chinese vehicles, you got problems with Europe where you have a trade agreement. You got problems with Asia where you have a trade agreement. There's a real potential squeeze coming here if Trump wins and goes ahead with this.
Yeah, and it's not just economic. The economic potential for trouble is enormous. But, David, for the last century and a half or so, we've been blessed. We've been blessed to live in the neighborhood that we've been living in. We're going to find out, hopefully tomorrow night, if not a few days afterwards, whether or not the U.S. will remain a guarantor, in effect, of Canada's security as well as its economic prosperity. We depend on the United States to defend us. The world is becoming a much more dangerous place, and some of that danger is coming over the Arctic Circle. So much is at stake, Canada, our security as well as our economic prosperity.
Yeah, you're very worried about that too, right? Like, what does it mean for Zelensky and negotiations with Putin? What does it mean for U.S. military presence over there? It's an understatement to say it's a massive day tomorrow. I want to thank you for being here with me on the eve of the U.S. election. I want to say goodbye to the power panel now. Thank you so much, Vonda Cotter, Gary Keller, Brad Levine, and Rob Rousseau. We appreciate it.